Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
If I could just take a moment and I had an assignment the other day. Someone asked me to write a letter for a time capsule that is going to be opened in Los Angeles 100 years from now on our tricentennial. It sounded like an easy assignment. They suggested I write something about the problems and issues of the day, and I set out to do so, riding down the coast in an automobile, looking at the blue Pacific out on one side and the Santa Ynez Mountains on the other, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was going to be that beautiful 100 years from now as it was on that summer day.
That's Ronald Reagan on August 19, 1976. I should say that's Governor Reagan, August 19, 1976. He's just lost the Republican nomination to President Gerald Ford, and Ford has invited the Reagans to join him on the dais at the RNC on the final night. It comes to my mind because Max Boot is here, the historian, the foreign policy analyst, the senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course the Washington Post columnist, and now, most importantly for our purposes, the author of the brand new Reagan, His Life and Legend. Max, thank you for being here. I got through all 700 pages and really thoroughly enjoyed it, learned a great deal about the president that I thought I knew so well. I don't know why, but the whole backstory of that speech really captivated me in your book. Paint the picture. What was going on that led to him coming up to the podium that night?
Well, that was first, thanks for having me on, Michael. Really appreciate it. And that speech was at the 1976 Republican Convention, where this was after a very hard-fought primary campaign between former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, and President Gerald Ford, where Reagan had actually come very close to defeating Gerald Ford, which is not something that's been done before in an open primary for the party's nomination. And he was defeated. But then on the last night of the convention, as Reagan and as former Governor Reagan and his wife Nancy and others were sitting up on the rafters at the convention center, Gerald Ford from the stage right there said, I invite my Ron to come on down and give some remarks. And this was not in the schedule. Reagan had some hints that this might happen, but it wasn't exactly something he'd agreed to. But he nevertheless walked down onto the stage in this massive national television audience and gave more or less an impromptu speech that had a lot of delegates basically saying, wow, we nominated the wrong guy, because this Reagan guy is quite a speaker. And I mean, he had thought about it before, certainly, but it was a very powerful, very short, but very powerful speech that really kept Reagan in the limelight and set the stage for him 4 years later to actually capture the nomination on his own.
As he's winding his way through the arena with Nancy, he's saying to her, I don't know what I'm going to say. And she's saying to him, don't worry, you'll come up with something. That's what caused me to pull the tape and to study it. I see no evidence of notes. There wasn't a teleprompter. I mean, even if he'd been tipped off by Deaver that morning, the point I want to make is his communication skills. I mean, the ability for him to stand that night and frankly steal the spotlight away from what had been a great Gerald Ford speech says a lot about Reagan's gift as a communicator.
Absolutely. And I think he was often maligned as being only an actor, somebody who had lines that were written by other people and was very good at reading a teleprompter. And he was very good at reading a teleprompter. But the bottom line is, he didn't need anybody to write his speeches for him, although he obviously, like all presidents, he later had people writing speeches for him. But throughout most of his career, he was giving his own speeches. He was giving his own remarks, and he would always be writing index cards. This goes back to his time in the 1950s as a spokesman for General Electric, giving speeches all over the country. He would always be filling out index cards. And when he was giving a speech, he would be shuffling his index cards to figure out what to say. And in fact, Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant, worked for him from 1966 on and knew him very, very well. And one of the best people I talked to in the course of my book research, Stu told me Reagan was the best speechwriter, not just the best speech giver, the best speech writer that he knew, because going back to his start as a radio sportscaster in the Midwest in the 1930s, Reagan had been communicating with people his entire life, and he knew how to give a speech that was meant to be heard, not read. And that was that 1976 speech at the convention was one example of many of these amazing speeches that Reagan would give, and sometimes completely impromptu, as was the case in 76.
Max, I had a great privilege 2 years ago in speaking at the Reagan Library. Shout out to John Hybush, who I know helped you with this book because you acknowledge him in the manuscript. And my favorite part of the Reagan Library, and I've been there many times, is they put in a cube, at least when I saw it, the note cards that were, I think, extracted from a shoebox at the home in Bel Air after Ronald Reagan passed away. And you can actually see his after dinner jokes and his lines and so forth. And as I learned from you in reading your book about Ronald Reagan, your biography, a lot of the stuff factually was questionable when he was talking policy. Although no one seems to think he was a prevaricator. Will you speak to that side of him?
Oh, he was definitely, he didn't have a dishonest bone in his body. I think that's absolutely true. In some ways, he was sort of a victim of his photographic memory. He had a very good memory. He could look at a movie script and memorize his lines very quickly. He was also a prodigious reader. He read a wide variety of materials, but sometimes he did not bring this critical scrutiny that he needed to the materials that he read. And so he would read something in some very ideological publication or in Reader's Digest or somewhere else, and the actual quote unquote facts were dubious. They weren't really facts. They were apocryphal facts or things that the writer wished were true but were not strictly true. But then Reagan, having read it once, it would be lodged in his memory forever, and it would also be written on his index cards, which you're right, he kept a steady stream of these index cards. And so he would be using them in speeches for years to come, even when they were challenged factually. And sometimes he had a sort of cavalier attitude towards this. He was in the 1960s, for example, he often said that no nation has ever survived that gives 1/3 of its national income to the government, which sounds sort of plausible, but isn't actually true. And, a graduate student actually asked him, what's the source for this, Governor Reagan? Where did you get this information? He said, I read it, and some economist said this a long time ago, and I don't have the source anymore, but, I just read it. So that was often the case, that he would just read something and it would lodge in his memory, and it wasn't accurate, and he would keep repeating it. But there's no question he did that in good faith. I don't think anybody thinks that Ronald Reagan would intentionally lie.
Max Boot's biography of Ronald Reagan is titled Reagan, His Life and Legend. I think I said this to you when you sent me a note before I ever even saw the advanced copy, that you were working on this book and that you'd been working on it for a decade. And I think my response then was to say, how is this turf unplowed? And it's still a question that I ask. You've convinced me, like no one has written in the detail that you have about Reagan. I'm just shocked that given the reverence that so many have for his presidency and Reagan the man, that no one had undertaken this before. And I'm kind of curious, during the 10 years that you were writing the book, were you nervous that another journalist of stature and historian would beat you to the punch?
I was certainly nervous starting out, but as I was spending those long years sitting in the reading room of the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, I kind of knew who else was there. And I did run across people who were writing, including Karen Tumulty, of my Washington Post colleague, who wrote a book about Nancy Reagan. We actually got to know each other during lunch breaks at the Reagan Library. But I also knew there wasn't anybody else who was sitting there writing a definitive biography of Ronald Reagan, which is what I set out to do. And I was very gratified today to see that the New Yorker had a long review of it, where they said Booth set out to write the definitive biography, and he succeeded. That's exactly what I've been trying to do for 10 years. And so and you're right, it's kind of amazing that there have been all these books about Reagan, but nobody to date has done that definitive biography. And I think part of it is just really the passage of time and the ability to take a more distanced perspective to somebody who was once a very polarizing figure, and to speak in a more honest and truthful way with people who knew him, and also to have access to a lot of documents, a lot of which are only recently opened for researchers.
You not only spent a lot of time at the Reagan Library, but you went places to put yourself in his shoes, including, by way of example, Reykjavik. I was curious, because you didn't tell us in the book, which of those locales had the most impact on you? Where were you standing that Reagan had stood that you thought, okay, I get something now?
By far, I would say his ranch outside of Santa Barbara.
Why?
I think anybody who really wants to understand Ronald Reagan needs to visit that ranch, because it's just Well, first off, it's a beautiful property with beautiful views, but it's a very modest place. I mean, it's a big spread, but the farmhouse itself, the ranch house, is exceedingly modest. It's a place with Formica counters and GE's appliances. It doesn't have, fancy designer appliances. The books in the along the walls are these well-thumbed volumes that Reagan actually read. It's not these kind of interior decorator books that people put out. In fact, all of the decor basically looks like it was scavenged from a thrift shop. It was a very small, very modest, very humble place. And you have to understand, this was his favorite place in the entire world. When he was president, he would be literally counting down the days until he'd get to his ranch in near Santa Barbara. And so it's really an indication of what was important to him. And it wasn't glitter, it wasn't glamour, it wasn't all these things that you associate with Hollywood celebrities or leading politicians. Some of the most revealing interviews I had with the book were, for example, with the Secret Service agents who protected him at the ranch, or with Dennis LeBlanc, who was this former California state policeman who was once his bodyguard and then became essentially his ranch hand, working with him at the ranch. And this was, Dennis and a fellow former California cop, Barney Barnett, who worked with him at the ranch. Those guys were actually probably Reagan's best friends. And I didn't realize that when I started out, but his best friends were not these Walter Annenbergs and all these rich moguls that he socialized with at Nancy's behest. His best friends were these blue-collar former cops that he, chopped wood with and did chores with at the ranch. That's really who Ronald Reagan was.
Well, he was. I mean, I learned so much about Reagan the man. I was more interested in the book to learn about the family dynamic and Reagan the individual than I was the Reagan years, which comes later in the book. I didn't recognize what a loner he was. You tell in the book, by way of illustration, that, and I'm doing this from memory, but I think that Peggy Noonan went to interview him. He brings her back for the farewell speech from the Oval Office, and she gets 5 different meetings, and still there's a quote in the book about how she walks out after the last of them and says that despite putting all those great words in his mouth, she still doesn't have a handle on the man.
That's exactly right. And that's the same frustration that Edmund Morris, his official biographer, had, the same frustration that many journalists had, because the same as the frustration as the guy who was the ghostwriter on his memoirs had, they all, were ultimately frustrated because Reagan was not very self-reflective. He didn't like to talk about himself. He didn't want to analyze his motives or, peer deep into his soul. He just wanted to move on and to kind of do his job and look forward. And so it requires a lot of research to try to really get at the roots of who Ronald Reagan was. And for example, the fact that he was a guy who was outwardly so congenial, so nice. Everybody liked Ronald Reagan. You couldn't meet the guy and not like him. And yet, at the end of the day, his aides noticed there was basically an iciness to him. There was a coldness to him. He was actually removed from them. He wasn't close to anybody other than possibly Nancy and his 2 ranch hands. With everybody else, they were often like the crews on his movies, where they would be very useful to him and he would happily work with them. But then he'd be on to the next movie and it'd be a totally different crew and he'd work with that crew. And he just did not get close to people, which really I think goes back to his childhood, where he was, very poor family, father, an alcoholic shoe salesman. They had to move from town to town all the time in small town Illinois. So he never really got close to the other kids. And that created this kind of reserve around him that lasted for his entire life.
He was also, I learned from you, Max Boot, very controversy averse. He did not want to be the one firing someone. He did not want to be the person having to deal with the consequences. And I think far more than I expected, he was pragmatic. He was not an ideologue. He was very pragmatic, both as governor of California and as president of the United States.
These are 2 of the central paradoxes that you have to grapple with Ronald Reagan. He could be famously confrontational as a politician, saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But in interpersonal relationships, he hated confrontation. And that was really also went back to his childhood, because he had a very troubled home with his parents screaming at each other and so forth. And so he didn't want that kind of close, hostile interactions, and he would shy away from. He wouldn't discipline his kids. He wouldn't fire aides. He kind of shied away from that. The other paradox, which I think is really central to understanding who Ronald Reagan was, is the fact that he could be very ideological, and as a campaigner, as a public speaker, he was often very far to the right, especially in the 60s and 70s. But then when he actually became governor and then president, he moved to the center and governed very pragmatically. And his whole philosophy was, I'm not going to be one of these go over the cliff with flags flying conservatives. That's a quote from Ronald Reagan. He had nothing but disdain for purists who wanted who thought it was like their way or the highway. As he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want and then come back for more and call that a victory. And so he was very willing to compromise with Democrats in both Sacramento and Washington, which I think surprised a lot of people, but that was true to his pragmatic core. And I think the root of why he was actually a pretty successful governor and president.
When I think of Ronald Reagan, I think Morning in America, I think family values, I think 80s conservatism, his own family dynamics. And I don't mean his upbringing, although they were troubled because of his father and the alcoholism and the moving, as you've just described, as a shoe salesman. But I'm thinking about the raising of his own children, both from Jane Wyman and from Nancy Davis. You have a line in the book where you say that his primary source of happiness was his wife and not his children. I was kind of disappointed in Reagan, the father. Will you take 60 seconds and speak to that?
Well, I think his kids were often somewhat disappointed
Yeah.
because if you read his memoirs, and they all wrote about this,
Right.
they were mostly filled with pain and anguish, all except for Ron Reagan, who was kind of his parents' favorite and got along better with them. But yeah, I mean, I think what happened in the home was that, he was kind of a typical absentee 1950s father, often on the road for GE. So Nancy Reagan was the one who was really raising the kids, and she had very sharp personality conflicts with Michael and with Patty in particular. And then Reagan would, show up on the weekend, and he would be kind of this genial, aloof presence who would take the kids to the ranch and have fun with them. And they all loved him. They all liked spending time with him. But he was not really that close to any of them and didn't really know that much about their lives. And so, with Michael Reagan, he disclosed that he was molested as a youngster. And his parents didn't know that until Michael published a book about it in the 1980s. So Reagan was very remote from his own kids. Not, he was well liked, but just he didn't really know what was going on with them. And I talked to a lot of people who described the family dynamics as often being dysfunctional, including his own kids, by the way. They would say the family dynamics. I mean, this is not stuff I'm making up. This is stuff the kids themselves say the family dynamics were dysfunctional. So yeah, there is a little bit of a paradox that this guy who espoused family values often had trouble practicing those values in his own family.
I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I loved hearing from you, don't give it away, the backstory as to why it was released in handwritten form instead of, as Reagan first said, let's get it typed up and distributed. Max, you did a hell of a job with the book. Look at the thickness of it. I've only scratched the surface with my guest. People who listen to this program, people who watch me are going to love Reagan, his life and legend. I congratulate you because I'm sure it was a mammoth task and I think it was well done.
Thank you so much, Michael. That means a lot to me. Really, really appreciate
I wouldn't say it if I didn't mean it. Max Boot, ladies and gentlemen, on Ronald Reagan. Good stuff.